Three parts. What I did for a title was it's called Uniting for Peace, Building Sustainable Peace Through Universal Values. That's the kind of theme of the overall conference. And then I subtitled The Potential Contribution of Transpersonal Peace Theory. And I'll explain what I mean by that. I suppose I am very interested in theory, and that's why I chose to be on this commission. I'm a kind of philosopher of peace, and I've been for many years. This talk is in three sections. The beginning is a bit of an introduction to autobiographical stuff, and each has said that all scholarship is autobiography. So I'm going to kind of explain the background of how I got into all this. Then I'm going to talk about the actual peace theory, the practical, the theoretical meat of my papers in a little bit. And then at the end I'm going to talk about some projects that my Peace Studies Institute is currently running, which actually fit in very well with what our friend was talking about. And you know, lots of other things that are going on here in this amazing conference. There'll be overlaps. Okay, so by way of introduction, the last IPRA conference I was at was in Sopron in Hungary in 2004. The first one was in the University of Sussex in 1988. I got into the study of comparative global philosophy, researching philosophy at the University of Bristol back in 1975-6. I found it very arid and actually anti-intellectual. I was dismissed as a metaphysician, which I took as a compliment. They meant it as an insult. Because A.J. Ayer and the logical positivist tradition in Britain were kind of silencing metaphysics in academia. So I actually resigned and walked to Stonehenge one beautiful May morning at the age of 19. And then went to live in Canada for 4 years, inspired by Wittgenstein's story, who I had a bit of respect for. Because he used to go off to Norway and spend time in the woods thinking and philosophizing. So I did the same in Canada for 4 years. And that was my really intense time of research. That's when I first read the Quran completely, the Bible, the Christian, Jewish Bible, discovered the Kabbalah, Sufism, and began a kind of lifelong comparative analysis of global philosophical traditions. And I did that purposely as a contribution intellectually to peacemaking. That's why I wanted to study philosophy. I came from a family that had been involved in anti-nuclear activism. As a kid, about 3, we used to go and see CND marches and so on. So it's kind of in my blood. From Canada, I moved back to London and founded a group called Philosophers and Historians for Peace in 1983. And we used to have meetings with a chap called John Francis Phipps, whose father had been the British ambassador in Berlin during the 30s. And he'd written a book called Time and the Bomb, like Luke Reichling's work. This was in 84. And we used to have amazing discussions in Notting Hill Gate about philosophy and peacemaking, and doctors used to come, philosophers, sociologists, historians, whatever. I then did a second degree at the University of London, but I chose to read contemporary global history and political philosophy, because I wanted to really come to grips with why the world was on the brink of nuclear omnicide. By this time I'd come across a group of philosophers launched at the World Congress of Philosophy in Montreal in 1983, by a man called Professor John Somerville, who'd worked as a philosopher in the 30s and was an expert on Marxism and dialectical materialism. And he'd actually gone to Russia, to the Institute of Philosophy, to study. And he was desperately trying to get dialogue between Russian, Soviet, and Western philosophers at a time when nobody was talking to anybody else and they were stockpiling nuclear arms. Right? I met him in 1988 at the World Congress of Philosophy. And then in 1990 I went to Moscow and was elected coordinator of Philosophers of Peace. And I met these incredible Russian intellectuals that were just coming out of the woodwork. Each one was a kind of polymathic genius who for years had been calling themselves a dialectical materialist. Now they were coming out and saying, well, that's just a cover story we have to say. Actually, I'm really interested in the dialectics of ultimate reality and how spirit and matter are interrelated. I met some incredible geniuses, and they elected me coordinator of Philosophers of Peace globally. There wasn't an IPRA commission of peace theories at the time. It came later. And so then I tried to kind of get in touch with philosophers all over the planet. And we had contacts in Egypt, in different parts of Europe. I was coordinating globally that network. Then, simultaneously, I worked for the University of London, creating an Institute of Peace Education, Peace Studies, at the Institute of Education, which is where they train teachers in Britain. and doing a lot of deep educational theory. And for 3 years I trotted around the planet visiting about 30 countries. And that's when I first really got involved with IPRA. I interviewed a lot of the key players in IPRA, many of whom are now dead, some of whom lectured for me at the University of London, at University College and at the Institute. And every time I'd ask them, what is your vision of peace? What's your peace theory? How are we going to get a peaceful world? In 1990, there was the signing of the Treaty of Paris. We thought there was going to be peace dividend, Cold War over, we can all get funding for peace studies and retire, you know? But I had this deep down sneaking horrible feeling that I could see people beginning to demonize the Islamic world and the Middle East. I could see there was a whole new rhetoric coming up to justify the military arms control industry. Or the argument against disarmament was, no, we need it because, look, there's all those horrible terrorists appearing. So that got me very interested in looking at interfaith peace building and trying to kind of, deconstruct that argument even before it was made, which took me to Cordoba in 91, 92 to a UNESCO-sponsored conference with IPRA. And we were trying to look at the golden age of Andalusia when Ibn Rushd and Ibn Arabi and the great Muslim Sufis and scientists. Ibn Rushd was a scientist and a philosopher, and then the great Christian thinkers like Raymond Lull and the Zohar, the Kabbalistic texts, were all being created in this amazing flourishing of thought going on in Spain, which was crossing borders and boundaries. It didn't matter if you were a Muslim or Christian Jew, those are just names. It's how close are you, how proximate are you to the active intellect, and how is your ethical lifestyle helping that access. I discovered that Abelard, who founded the University of Paris, was in touch with thinkers in Spain who were working on the cusp of those three religions. Right? So I carried on with that work. I'm something of an expert on that time of Andalusia. I've just been back to Cordoba, and I've spoken at the Ibn Arabi Society and so on. I think, as a peace philosopher, what I look for is examples in the past of great thinkers who've talked about peace, and then we can use them as beacons for us now. I launched the International Institute of Peace Studies and Global Philosophy at the University of London in '91 during the first Gulf War. I said, enough is enough. We're blowing up the planet here, and I'm trying to organise philosophers of peace globally. I have to fight back. So the Institute came into being. We used to have meetings at different colleges within the University of London, which is the biggest university in the English-speaking world. It's a federation of many great institutions in their own right. And I met some incredible people, like Maurice Wilkins, the founder, the discoverer of DNA, was one of the patrons, and many members of the Royal Society were involved. And anyway, for reasons that it all came to a sort of head when I launched in 1995. And this relates to some of the stuff that Linda Groff was talking about in the last presentation. The obvious cutting edge of peace theory, what we need to be doing now is looking at multicultural disputes, faith disputes. So what kind of tool can we have? So I came up with this idea of the Multifaith and Multicultural Mediation Service, MMS. And I launched it in Oxford. I was teaching at the University of Oxford at the time on kind of comparative religious studies. And it's still the only interfaith mediation service on the planet, which is absurd, and we've been involved in behind-the-scenes mediation with faith disputes. Also in '97 I launched the Commonwealth Interfaith Network. I'm Canadian, British. And I think the Commonwealth is an interesting... I don't agree with Galton's complete dismissal of British intellectuals. He was very damning in his earlier presentation. I'm going to have words with him later. We did learn a lot from that experience, and we've kind of learned how it is possible to have a multicultural, vibrant community. If you go to Bradford or London or Birmingham or Southall, many of my students were all different parts of the Commonwealth. I've travelled in India 7 times. It is a possibility of showing how peace can be possible. So the Commonwealth Interfaith Network deals with interfaith discourse from Commonwealth countries, which is for 54 nations, right? Anyway, that's all kind of the background. It's the first part of my paper. I rattled through it. The second part, I want to talk about the theory. So whilst I'm doing all that, and I was travelling to 30 countries interviewing these peace experts, right, I was thinking, right? I wasn't, there's the bureaucracy of trying to organise philosophers, conferences and stuff like this. But then there's the kind of pure theory, which is also what I love. So what did I do? Okay, well, I asked myself, when I started out on this work in 88, 90, what can I contribute to this melange? You know, here are these great minds, they're all doing their stuff. You know, Galton was obviously a AAA genius. There's Kenneth Boulding, who's also a poet. Nobody mentioned that, you know, Elise Boulding, who I met. So where can little me contribute? So I thought about this, I chewed on it, I went to all these conferences, and I decided, and I talked to Paul Smoker about it, and, you know, the people in Cordoba and so on. And I came to the conclusion that what I do is, firstly I had to limit my time frame for the PhD. So I chose the 50 years since the end of World War II, which is kind of the history of peace studies. So I looked at the time frame from 1945 to 2001. I didn't know I was going to stop in 2001 until 9/11 happened. I thought that was quite a good cut-off point. So during that 50-year time frame, or 56 years, I then said, okay, I'm going to take a cross-section of the work of different intellectual families and see what they found in the field of peace studies and peace research. You know, what have they come up with that's of any value? If these guys have all been having IPRA conferences ever since the 60s, what do they actually do? You know, so then I said, okay, well, which ones should I look at? Of course, being a young academic, I wanted to look at everything. There's going to be a chapter on absolutely every field of knowledge, right? Science, economics, natural science, psychology, blah, blah. Then I realised when I was into the word count game that I was running out of space. So I restricted it to, firstly I looked at historians, because this was an intellectual history of 50 years of searching for peace. So I looked at the role of historians themselves. I'd studied at one of the most important schools of historians in the Western world, the Institute of Historical Research, and there was an awful lack of talk about peace history. I had to really ferry in the basement and find the old archives. And I came across some amazing historians who thought about peace. People like Toynbee and, you know, many great historians have actually been motivated. And if you go back to Herodotus, the father of history, he was trying to solve the problem between Greece and Iran. And I was inspired by these great historians, you know, to look at peace history. And I met people like Peter van den Dungen, who's a peace historian at Bradford, and there are a few. Bart de Licht, who was librarian at the Peace Palace Library. You know. So I discovered all that, Peter Brock, who did kind of pacifist history. So that was a rich theme, so I wrote a chapter about that. Then I looked at philosophers. What on earth are philosophers for if they're not talking about peace when we're living in this time of global threat of omnicide? And of course I met Somerville, and I'd been elected coordinator, so I knew some of these guys, and I just wrote up their life stories really, and was able to talk about how Eastern and Western philosophy were beginning to have a dialogue. But the different schools of thought, and I was looking at sort of, you know, existentialist thought, feminist philosophy, and you know, personalism and just war theory. So there's a whole chapter on philosophers, what they've been up to. Then I looked at religious thinkers and theologians, because obviously you can't take God out of this discussion. And we have to be honest, a lot of the great peace activists during this 50-year period were inspired by their spiritual beliefs, like Gandhi and Martin Luther King and so on. So I looked specifically, and by then I was also Secretary General of a thing called the World Conference on Religion and Peace, which is the biggest interfaith group. So that, I met them all, you know, people like Hans Kuhn. I went to the Vatican in '95 to one of the big world conferences of religious leaders. I met, you know, Islamic, Buddhist, Jewish, Christian thinkers. And so I was able to write up that chapter. But I was disappointed, I have to say, I was disappointed by the religious bigwigs. I mean, I met Mahagosananda, and he was really humble. I loved him. I met some living saints, but I also met a lot of quite pompous cardinal types who were very proud of their position, status, and hierarchy. And I wrote up a chapter which is interesting, so the meat of the thesis. It's fairly critical of the way that religious hierarchies actually might be promoting and sustaining conflict. And I looked at the conflict within religions between exoteric and esoteric interpretations. So, for instance, the text you've quoted to us from a Sufi perspective, you know, there are hundreds of other Muslim theologians that interpret those texts entirely differently, and it's a rallying call to go out there and cut heads off. And so there's a battle within the soul of Islam. There's also a battle within Christianity between the fundamentalist Texan redneck Baptist pastor who burns the Quran and wants to go and bomb, Islamic countries, and the Quaker, sitting in silence who wants everybody to hug. And so I looked at that in great detail, and then I looked at the role of psychologists because I thought, okay, so it's like Hermann Hesse's kind of glass bead game. You've got to try every move to make it come out right. So I thought if we look at psychologists, then maybe they've got the answer. And this is where I got some hope, because I've always been interested in depth psychology, Carl Jung, psychology that takes spirituality seriously and is prepared to examine it scientifically. See, I think these religious disputes are too important to leave to the religious leaders, actually. They haven't got a clue, with all due respect, because they're quite narrowly educated. And I think this is true of your extremist rabbi, or your Christian cleric, or your Muslim, or whatever. Even Buddhists are now starting to attack other religions, So the psychologists, and I got very interested in transpersonal psychology. It's a branch of psychology that looks at noetic experience. It looks at religious experience. It looks at things like Muhammad in the cave getting downloads from Archangel Gabriel. It tries to explain what's going on psychologically. It looks at Christ in the desert, being tempted by Satan. Well, what's going on in the psyche of these people? It looks at Buddha reaching enlightenment. What was that about? Or Mahavira, the Jain founder. So I argue in the thesis that transpersonal psychology for the first time gives us a theoretical basis on which to evaluate, situate, contextualize, and compare and contrast all the spiritual traditions of mankind, and to do so in an objective way, as well as as in the sense that Hegel talks about objective spirit. So within the framework of an objective spiritual analysis of man's history. Right? So that was, I think, the most exciting thing I did, and then I ended by calling for a new kind of history to help heal these conflicts, which I call the transpersonal historiography. You see, most historians that go and study, they get diplomatic history, political history, a bit of social history, economic history. It's history of the out there. That's history. What I'm talking about by transpersonal history is the history of the in here. It's the history of our subjective evolution as human beings, from the very earliest times of historical records. I just went around the Archaeological Museum here in Istanbul, which I recommend people to do. It's absolutely awesome. They have finds from the very earliest period of human settlement in the Middle East. And there's these different layers, not just factually. This is where Marxist interpretation of history, I think, is flawed, in that it looks at the tools we use and argues that that's what is the dynamic, transformative factor in history. I'm saying it's the tools and the mind that uses the tools, and the mind that thinks up the tools. It's the mind that can think this stuff up, and the next gizmos 100 years from now. That's where we're going to get peace, when we sort of think the tools, and that will come as we grow in self-knowledge, and essentially reach, planetary enlightenment. So I've written a book about comparative enlightenment within all the different religious traditions, and it is there. You can become an enlightened Muslim, an enlightened Jew, a Christian, a Buddhist, a pagan. I've also spent time mediating disputes involving indigenous communities who are underrepresented in the world's, often in the world's interfaith forum. They have a few token Aborigines. But I met loads of very interesting pagans in Britain, Druids and others, who got me involved in their campaign to access their sacred site at Stonehenge, and taught me an awful lot about indigenous tradition in Britain and Ireland, which I hadn't really got a clue about. I just had some instinct. Now I know about more where they're coming from. So with this noetic transformation, I think transpersonal history can be a tool for peacemaking at that fundamental level of paradigm clashes. Look at the Yazidis. They're an ancient pre-Christian, pre-Islamic, pre-Jewish tradition that goes right back. They have holy scriptures that explain the context of the same story in the Quran, but from the point of view of Iblis, which is a story that's not told very often, And it's a very, very interesting story. So what I'm saying is, if we pull, or if you look at, say, the Japanese Shinto religion, again, incredible wisdom of indigenous pagan traditions from Japan. They have a sacredness, a reverence for the sun, for the kami, the deities that inhabit nature and each other. It's very similar to Hinduism at its best. So I think the key to peace is through developing transpersonal history, and it's an offering. And then I did, because that wasn't enough, I thought, well, I'll produce an appendix, and I did an encyclopedia of every single thinker during that time period written about transpersonal thought, just like an encyclopedia. And the whole appendix was another few hundred pages. And then I did a dictionary. I was very excited about your Arabic stuff, because as a philosopher for peace years ago, I thought, well, we need a dictionary of philosophical terminology, and there isn't one. So I produced one with volunteers. So you've got words. I said, what are the 100 best words that we need, like words for truth, love, light, God, justice, peace, And then let's get them in every single language, Arabic, Hebrew, Greek, including the ancient languages, like ancient Egyptian, Etruscan, Sumerian, and so on. So that's a dictionary that I produced, and it was as part of the appendix to the thesis, but it was a huge thing. Okay, so that's the theory bit. That's the second bit of my talk. I'm going to briefly now talk about what I'm doing with all this. I spent a long time on that theory stuff, and you can read it, it's published. Okay, the third portion of the paper is about some of the projects I'm doing based on transpersonal peace theory, okay, which I think a lot of the speakers in this morning, Galton, Linda Groff, Katsuya, who I know, they're all actually talking about transpersonal peace theory. It's just they're not using that term, The first thing, and this is why it's so exciting to be sharing this panel with you, is that I've decided that sacred texts are a problem. And I've begun, because I've also trained and worked as a religious studies teacher at schools in Britain. For 10 years I taught, as head of religious studies at all kinds of schools. And I encountered kids that didn't want to learn, that threw Bibles around the room, thought sacred texts were things to rip up and throw out the window, I've tried to find ways to make people realise that sacred texts are actually sacred and what does that mean. So I've been working on a comparative commentary, just starting to begin with the Jewish, Christian and Muslim texts. So because I have some Arabic, some Hebrew, some Aramaic, some Greek, some Latin, and a polymath, I've done a kind of recorded commentary of 200 teaching hours on the Quran and on the Jewish Ketuvim, which are the wisdom scriptures, and also on the New Testament. And what I'm trying to do in my analysis is apply the tools of transpersonal history, which I think is an objective way of looking at the spiritual context in which those verses were revealed. And, I think very similar to people that you mentioned, those Islamic scholars. I taught at the Muslim College in London with Dr. Zaki Badawi. And, so that's one project I'm doing. Another project that we've launched, and I just want to quote the hadith from Muhammad, the ink of the scholar is worth more than the blood of the martyr. This to me is my motto, right? I think this is what should be the motto of all of us here at the IPRA conference. The second project is, in 2008, I went to Israel and Palestine to interview people, leaders, went to Bethlehem, to East Jerusalem, West Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and to launch the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the Middle East, okay, the TRCME. Now, you won't have heard of it, I've gone under the radar. I'm not working at intergovernmental level because I don't trust governmental level of operation. I've done enough of that stuff. I used to run meetings in the House of Lords, and I've been to the Foreign Office, and I'm very disappointed with politicians. They don't seem to adhere to the kind of codes of conduct and truthfulness that I, as a philosopher, would say is a precondition for getting peace on the planet. So I'd rather work directly with people like you, local community leaders, intellectuals, and we've produced a documentary of that. I then went back in 2013, I think it was, 2012, and did a whole bunch of other interviews recorded with Jewish intellectuals. There was an amazing guy called Judge Shlomo Soham, who was attached to the Knesset as their future responsibility monitor officer. So every bit of legislation that went through the Knesset, he had to ask, how will this affect people living 7 generations from now? Is this a good idea? And he would write a report, we'll build a new superhighway from Haifa through to, Istanbul, we'll knock everything down. No, he'd write, no, this is not good. But he was a visionary, interested in future intelligence. And there are amazing people on both sides of the communities that inspired me. But also, further afield, the TRC for the Middle East is obviously, I've talked to people from Iraq and Afghanistan and the whole region. And it really upsets me what's going on at the moment. And if anyone wants to help, that'd be jolly good. I also think, and I was in touch with the Turkish Foreign Minister trying to get a meeting at this conference, and I got to speak to one of their head of policy people. Turkey's proposal is to join the European Union as their ambition. I've got a different suggestion, which is that what Turkey should do, and I love the Turkish culture, as Galton was saying, it's a very sophisticated kind of Islam, the Bektashis and so on. These are amazing and quite scientific in their views. Why can't Turkey take a pioneer role in setting up a Middle East Union, like a European Union, but for all the countries of the Middle East, right? And within it would be a peace treaty, so that no country in the Middle Eastern Union attacks everybody else. And then the European Union would have a peace treaty with that. So that's kind of an offshoot from the TRC for the Middle East. And I've written about that. And I attended a meeting in London way back of the Federal Trust for Education and Research, which was set up by Lord Beveridge, who ran the LSE, and was thinking about federalism. And this underlay a lot of the thinking of the European Union. Now, it's coming in for a lot of flack. People in Britain maybe don't want. We don't want a European Union that meddles in everything like the size of our water bottles. What we do want is a European Union that guarantees peace. Okay, and I'll come on to my next project about that. And I think it would be a jolly good idea for the Middle East. So, that's a project of my institute. The third project is the European Union Mediation Service. Again, I think this is such an obvious project. It came to me when I was traveling back from Israel-Palestine through Athens and then up to Venice through the Balkans. And it was a time when Ukraine and Russia were beginning to argue about gas. This was about 2009. And because I've got a kind of access to a bigger picture than some people, of temporal extension through just active intelligence, really, I could see trouble. I could see there's going to be trouble on the frontiers of the European Union. We better get our act together and create a mediation service so we can help our neighbours stay in peace with each other. And I wrote to the diplomats, I wrote to the head of the European Union, I wrote to the British Foreign Office. I said, get together a European Union mediation service. It would be staffed by really boring bureaucrats, kind of Germanic types with clipboards and suits, who'd go into every little micro thing about the conflict, and it would bore them into peace. And it would be funded, it would be part of the European Union, it would have a budget of a couple of, whatever it takes. And then we could prevent conflicts like Ukraine and all the others that are around on the edge of the European Union, including the Mediterranean Sea conflicts. And that's a live project. And what annoys me is when I was starting to write to Baroness Ashton, when she was appointed European Foreign Affairs Commissioner, or whatever she's called, she first wrote back saying, this is a useless idea, can't afford this, no, go away. I kept writing every few months. And gradually she kept saying, well, this is very interesting, actually we're doing some of this. And then it was, well, actually we set up this thing to do that. And then they got the European Peace Prize, and Nobel Peace Prize. But I don't think they're actually delivering. So the European Mediation Service is something they should do. I'm going to skip a couple of things. Another project I've been working on is in the British-Irish context, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for Ireland and Britain. I'm quarter Irish. I've met lots of people involved in both sides of all that. And I think that it's a good, what we managed to do, touch wood, it's holding, is a good model for how it can be done in other countries. If the Irish and the British could make peace, then I promise you even the Syrians can. Anyone, because the Irish really and the British, we love each other so much we hate each other. It's a complex business. And I worked with Dr. Sean English, who's involved with this work in Dublin. I think he used to be on the Peace Theories Commission. He's not here though, he's supposed to come. Yeah. Okay, so then we've got another project, the Golden Gate Project, which is about reopening the Golden Gate in East Jerusalem. And then a project called Education Aid, which is about mobilizing educational institutions around the planet. And then a project called the Centre for Peace Policy Research. You know, there's a lot of defence policy research, security policy, foreign policy. Nobody on the planet, apart from this centre, is looking at peace policy. Because I worked with the British Foreign Office and think tanks, you know, I think we need to think through a peace policy. And one of the outcomes of this conference should be getting that idea out there. So that's when you take theory into praxis. That's the policy field. And I've been bashing on the British government. You know, I would like them to have a peace policy about Ukraine or about Libya that doesn't involve bombing people. That involves mediating and aid and development and education. And I'll keep bashing on them for that. And then, yeah, so then finally, just to say a postscript, obviously the Gaza thing was blowing up as I was writing this paper. And so I've come up with a kind of IPSGP peace plan. IPSGP is the acronym of my institute, based now in Castle in Scotland. And it's an autonomous 19-point plan, which I think is about a peace policy in action. You know, mutual ceasefire, military disengagement. I think a UN peacekeeping force should go into Gaza to patrol the perimeter. And I'm proposing, and I think this is a really wonderful idea, I used to know the head of the Palestinian government in London, Afif Safia, was a good friend of mine, and he always said, you know, Thomas, when we get independence, we want to join the Commonwealth. We want the protection of that big club. And I think that's a brilliant idea as a Canadian. You know, I think that Palestine should be invited to join the Commonwealth. And we should fast track that application. And then it would access, Palestine would access, the kind of state building mechanisms the Commonwealth can afford. And also, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, you know, these are rich countries. We could rebuild their airport and their port in Gaza and lift the blockade. And I think we're big enough and intelligent enough to, in a friendly and loving way, say to the Israelis, look, we love you too, but actually, you know, we had the mandate for all of you. We need to give these other people their stake now. It's our parting gift. Sorry it took 50 years. So that's the kind of part of the peace plan. Anyway, there we are, peace theory in action. Okay, I'll finish there. Thank you so much.
Now to bring these wonderful, diverse presentations together, Juliette Bennett is a doctoral student in Sydney, University of Sydney, and she will be to give some comments on these two presentations.